For video editors, the Magnates Media editing style seems impossible to learn, but this could not be further from the truth. And I know this because I learned this video editing style all by myself, and I also taught hundreds of thousands of editors to do it too. So by the end of this video, you will fully understand how to set up a basic 3D scene in After Effects, and I've broken that down into 3 steps. Step 1. Image generation and separation. So in this step, we will use AI to generate an image. We will then take it into Photoshop where we will separate it into 3 distinct layers. Step 2. Setting up the 3D scene. In this step, we will take the 3 layers that we made and we will distance them in 3D space. So when we move the 3D camera, it will give the appearance that some are closer to the camera than others. This brings the scene to life and makes it look less flat and more dynamic in 3D. Step 3. Adding the camera movements. By this step, we would have already done the most difficult part of the edits. So now it's just adding the keyframes to the camera and making sure that they move smoothly. In this step, I will also show you 2 bonus tricks which Magnates Media use to enhance their edits. Also, there's a link in the description where you can access all of the assets used in this video so you can follow along too. Now let's get into it. So now we're going to come to Microsoft Designer. Now this is just a random AI image generator, but you can pick any. I just chose this because it's free and people can follow along too. So in order to generate images using this software, you're going to need an account with Outlook. So if you don't have an account already, create one and log in. And once you've done that, you should see this page. So we're going to come up to Create with AI and come down to Images. Here you can add your description of what you want to create, and you can also add the size of the image. So we're going to choose wide. And it's likely that this will automatically be set to square, so make sure you remember to change this. Now for this video, I have already prepared an AI generated image which I want to use, but I'm just going to show you how the prompts work. So again, make sure that you've selected the wide, and you come to description, and let's think of something Magnates Media. Let's think 2 businessmen, oh, can't type today, 2 businessmen standing in a room. And let's search that up. And you can see that it comes up with pretty good images, standard for a channel like Magnates Media. Although today we're going to use an image which I've already generated and I've linked in the description too. So if you want to follow along, go to that link and download this image. Once you've downloaded that, we're going to jump into Photoshop. Once you're in Photoshop, we're going to come up to this top left section here and we're going to press New File. And we're going to make it 1920 by 1080. So you can just do that in the section here. Make sure you've selected pixels. The width is set to 1920 and the height is set to 1080. Resolution should be set to 300 already. And we'll just set this title here to image. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag our image here and we're just going to expand it so it fills out these corners. So we're just going to press and drag it to the left so it snaps there. Then we're just going to increase the size of it so it covers the entire screen. Now we're just going to come to the bottom right and we're just going to delete the background. So now you can see that we have our image here, but it doesn't have a lot of space at the top and the bottom. So when we come to doing our camera movements, we're not going to have much to work with. So what we want to do is we're going to come to this crop tool and make sure that you're on the newest version of Photoshop. And we're just going to drag this here upwards just to give us some space, and drag this here downwards. And now we've got a much bigger composition to work with. So we're going to come down here to Generative Expand, and it's going to say, what would you like to generate? Let me just bring this to the middle here. Now you can type in a prompt and it will generate whatever you're looking for, but we just want it to expand the image just based on the image itself. So we're just going to press generate. We're going to leave that blank and wait for that to do its thing. So now you can see we've got 3 different variations of our image. Now I like this one the most, as this just has a lot of clear space, so if there was going to be text there or whatever, it won't be blocked up by these clouds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I have the image which I like the most selected, and then I'm going to select it down here. You see how it says Generative Expand? I'm going to left click it, I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to left click this bottom layer too. And then I'm going to press Ctrl E to merge the images. So now you can see this is just one image. What we're going to do with this is we're going to separate out 3 different sections of it. So when we put it into After Effects, we can distance them so it will appear like it's 3D. So first of all, I want to mask out this part here where we have this line and the two men standing there. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to come up to the select. We're going to go down to select and mask. And what we're going to do, we're going to make sure we have a relatively small size for the brush, and we're just going to mask out this area here. And essentially anything in purple will be masked out. So we want to make sure that these two men here and this foreground here is all not purple. Now this might be a different color for you. It doesn't matter what color it is, it might be red. And we're just going to come in here and mask it out. So if you use left click and drag, it will use it like a brush tool and it will just get rid of this purple. If you hold Alt and left click, this means it will add purple. So it will add to what is masked out. So this is important if you've added anything into the mask which you didn't mean to. Now to get these inner details here, we just want to come in, zoom in using Alt and scroll. I'm just going to come in here, hold Alt. I'm going to make this purple because I don't want that part of my image. This mask that we're doing here is only a rough mask. So you see how these edges are purple? If I keep trying to tweak it, it might just get a bit precarious. So once we have a rough mask like this, we're going to come here to the bottom right and we're going to press new layer with layer mask. And this is very important. So make sure you press with layer mask. I'm going to press OK. Now you can see that parts of his face is masked out when it's not meant to be. And this is okay because we can come here to the bottom right. We can left click on this, specifically this black and white part. And then we can select our brush tool here. And we can make sure that our two colors are black and white. So now if we use our brush, anything black will be masked out. And conversely, if we press X, we can switch between them easily. If we draw with the white, it will add things into the mask. So now we can do our fine tuning of the mask where we couldn't do it before. So like I said, we want to make sure that the mask is perfect. And we're going to use the brush tool to do so. And this might be a slow process, but this all makes the finished product look better. Furthermore, if you come to the smoothing at the top here and you turn it to 100%, this will just make your edges much smoother. Whereas if you turn this down, it just makes it a little more difficult to make all these edges smooth. Right, so to me, this is a pretty good result. Now we can see that we've masked out just this area. So what we want to do now is create the background layer, but we don't want this background to include these two men here, because when it moves around, we're going to see these two men in the back and it's going to look like this and it's going to look horrific. So we need to remove these two men from the background. So now we're going to hold Alt and we're going to left click and drag this mask onto the bottom layer. Right click on this black and white section and we're going to press add mask to selection. So now we've selected everything within the mask. Then we're just going to delete the layer mask by right clicking and pressing delete layer mask. So now what we're going to do is generative fill within this area here. And we're going to do that by first making sure that we have enough space. So we're just going to expand the selection by say 15 pixels. Then we're going to press generative fill and we can leave this blank. Now it appears that nothing has happened, although that's just because the top layer is visible. If we just take away that top layer, we can now see that we've got a clear background. Now we just need to find one which we're happy with, and I think something like this looks the best, but you can always generate again, and I think I'm going to do that now. Now this looks more like something I'd like to use. And now you can see that we have the background here and we have the two men and the field separated. So if I was to move this top layer, we can see it's not going to look weird because they're not appearing twice. So all we need to do is just take this bottom layer here and the bottom layer there, and we're just going to press Ctrl and E so we can merge them. So now this is one flat image and this is one flat image. We're just going to name this background, and we can now also apply this layer mask and we'll name this foreground. So this would be enough to create the parallax effect and make it look 3D. Although if we just go one step further, we can take this to the next level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the background here. I'm going to come to select and mask, and I'm going to mask out this entire area but the sky. So let me select something like a blue. You can see here, I can just select this object and this will select everything but the sky. So if I just use that object selection, you can see we got a rough selection of everything. Now we can just come back to our brush, increase the size because it's bigger, and we're just going to make sure that the sky is the only thing that's blue. Now we're just going to press new layer with layer mask. What we're going to do is we're going to have two layers. This one has a mask, this one doesn't. So we're just going to do what we did again. We're going to hold Alt and we're going to left click and drag this to the bottom layer. Now we have two identical layers, but we're going to make this top one not visible. We're then going to come to this bottom layer here. We're going to right click. We're going to press add mask to selection. And then we're just going to delete this mask like that. So now you can see everything but the sky is within this selection. So when we do our generative fill, it's just going to create one massive sky. So again, to be safe, I'm going to make sure that we expand our selection just slightly, 15 pixels or maybe 10, just so we get a little bit of a gap. Then we're just going to press generative fill and generate. Now these generations are nothing like what I'm looking for, so I'm just going to search up sky, and this is more like what we're looking for. So we can take a look. I'd say that this is the most like what I was looking for. So we just have one layer which is just purely the sky. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this one here, which is visible now, and I'm also going to select this background layer here, and I'm just going to merge them together. So now you can see we have the sky as a separate layer here, which we can move. We also have this layer here, which we can move by itself, and we have this layer. So they're all separate. So when we come into After Effects, we're going to have three separate layers which we can work with. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to apply this layer mask here, and I'm just going to call this midground. So now we know we have the foreground, this one here, we have the midground, this one here, and we have the sky, this one here. Three separate layers. And all you want to do is come up to File, and you just want to save as, and just save it somewhere where you know, whatever folder you want. Now I will meet you in After Effects. So now we're just going to come to New Composition and just copy these settings here. So once you've done that, we can just press OK. And now we can drag our file into the composition. So I'm just going to drag it in here, and it's going to give you a few options. So import kind, I usually just set this to composition. And with the layer options, it's very important that you make sure it is on editable layer styles. That is very important. Now we're just going to press OK. So as you can see, we have our Photoshop file here, although it doesn't look as large as it was in Photoshop. So the reason for that is that we have a composition of 1920 by 1080. But the actual image is a lot bigger than that. But all we need to do is just take it out of this pre-composition, and we're just going to hold shift and select each of these images, press Ctrl and C at the same time to copy it. And then we're just going to paste it into our main composition. Now we're just going to select all of these again by holding shift and left click. And we're just going to drag it up so these two men are in the middle of the screen. And we can also come down here and turn on the proportional grid. So we can see that they're roughly in the middle and their heads roughly line up to this line here. So what we want to do next is we want to hold shift, we want to select all of these again, and we want to right click and press 3D layer. Now these layers are 3D, so we can move it in the X-axis, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. Now remember how earlier in the video I mentioned that we want to create distance between these layers. Well, that's what we're about to do now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the angle of view so I can make this a little bit easier to explain. So all I'm going to do is come into the custom view 1. Now don't get intimidated. This is very simple to understand. Let me just add in a camera. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to press new, I'm going to press camera. Now just copy all of these settings that I have here. So I have film size at 36mm, the angle of view is roughly at 29 degrees, and I've turned off enable depth of field. And also make sure that this is on 2-node camera. So now we can see here, we have our camera, our 3D camera, just imagine it as a real camera, and we have our scene. This image, which we took into the composition here. This is very flat. Now imagine you're in the theater and you're watching a play. Whatever backdrop they have is not on the same plane as the actors. The actors would usually be in front of this background here. They would usually be in front of it. So if we keep this as a flat image, when we move the camera, it won't look 3D. So what we will do, we will come to the position of the foreground layer, which is that first layer which we made, and we're going to set this position to roughly -1000. And that should bring it closer to the camera. Now, if I just drag these values, you can just see all it's doing is dragging it closer to the camera. Now, the reason that I chose -1000 is just because this is far enough from the camera to make it move enough to look 3D. Now, we don't only want to do this for this layer here. Now, we want to also do this for the sky. And to do this, we're just going to drag this to the right and move it further away from this middle layer here. Now, something like 400 is a rough value, which is good enough. So you can see that we've created a distance between our 3 layers. And this will all make sense when we start to move the 3D camera. So let's come back into the default active camera here and make sure that it's the active camera, otherwise you won't see any difference. So we're going to come into the active camera, and now you can see that all the layers look slightly disproportionate now. Well, that's because some have moved closer. So all we need to do to fix this is we need to come into the scale and we need to scale it down. So if I zoom out a little bit by using my scroll wheel and the scrolling down, we can see that some of these images are massive and then some of them are smaller, but we want them to all be proportionate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the scale of this front image here, roughly to something like that. And then I'm going to come to the sky here and I'm going to increase the scale. So now you can see that everything here is proportionate. And also you don't get these weird black bits here which appear. So now we come to moving the 3D camera. Now most of the hard work has been done, and if you just pay attention to this section, the 3D camera won't be as daunting as it appears. So the first thing I'm going to do is explain how the 3D camera works. Now we chose the 3D camera which has 2 nodes. So essentially if I come back to this custom view, the camera has a point of interest. So my shoulders and my neck and my body will not move, but I can move my head. I can move the direction where my eyes are looking. That is the point of interest. Now the position of the camera is actually where my body is positioned. So let's say instead of just moving my head, now I'm moving my entire body. That is moving the position. So that is essentially the 2 things here which we're going to be using: position and point of interest. Now, the 2-node camera can become awkward to use because let's say you want to move your body this way and you want to make sure that everything is still looking that direction. Well, the 3D camera kind of works like this. It will have a point of interest. So let's say the camera is the point of interest. I'm looking at the camera now. If I move the position, it's going to do this. See how I'm still looking at the camera? Whereas if I just want to do a movement where the point of interest moves with the body, so it's like my head being stuck here and my body moves and I'm still looking that way. See how I'm no longer looking at the camera? Well, that can be very awkward to do with the 3D camera, as you would have to keyframe both of these values in order to make that movement where the point of interest follows the position. Now, we don't like complication. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here, we're going to right click, we're going to come to new, we're going to come to null object. Now we're going to parent link the camera to the null object. Now this should be here. It's a little whip thing and you just drag it onto the null. Now this null object gives us just one value where we can now move the body or the position and the point of interest at the same time just by keyframing one value. But we also get the flexibility of having a value which we can change the point of interest. So if I wanted to just move the body and the point of interest with one value, I can do that. But what if I wanted to move the body here and then move the point of interest there? Well, this is why we parent link the camera to a null object. So I'm going to come back to this normal view here. Now I'm going to make this null object 3D. So essentially this null object works like the camera was a 1-node camera. So I can move it forward, I can move it backward with just one value. I can move it up, I can move it down with just one value. But if I was to try and do that with the camera, it would look more like this and you can see the difference. Or if I was to use the point of interest, it'll look more like this. Now, all of these values have their uses. It's just, we want the most flexibility. And this gives us the benefits of both the 2-node camera and a one node camera just by doing this small step. So we're going to keep the movements for this video quite simple, as this is just a basic 3D scene. So we're going to mostly be using the null object. We're going to be keyframing this position. Now, I don't want this position to start here. This is pretty boring. I want the position to actually start somewhere else, and then the two men come into the perspective of the camera. So to do that, I'm going to come to the position here, and you can just press P on the keyboard in order to bring that up. And I'm going to zoom into the scene. I'm going to zoom in, roughly about there. Then I'm going to take this middle value and I'm going to move the camera up. So we've moved up here. I'm just going to zoom in a little more. Now I'm going to come to about 7-8 seconds. And I'm going to reset the values. So all you need to do to reset is right click on this blue part and then just press reset. Now you can see we've created a movement. And the two men come into view. Now I want this to come a little bit further in, so the zoom in looks more like that. There we go. Now you can see that it appears that the sky is moving at a different rate to this middle part. And these bottom bits here are moving at a different rate to these top parts. Now let's just say that we reset all these values, and instead of having a nice dynamic setup for our 3D scene, we instead had a flat setup. So all I'm going to do is reset all of these and bring it back to what it would have been. Now you can see that all this is just one flat thing. Let's take a look at our camera movement now. Much more boring, right? It doesn't look 3D. There's no parallax effect. Now if I just come back to what it was, we can see now that each thing moves differently in relation to each other, and this is what creates the 3D look. So it's very important that you make sure with whatever edit you're doing that you're creating a separation between the background and the foreground, because this is what makes it look 3D. Camera movement without this difference in distance from the camera does not look good. This is a very big mistake that people make, and that's why your edits might not be looking as professional as something from Magnates Media. So with that all clarified, we now want to come to the keyframes. Now it starts off the same speed as it ends, and it also ends quite abruptly. We do not want this. This is a beginner's mistake, and the keyframes is the difference between someone who gets hired and someone who doesn't. But thankfully, it's very easy to fix your keyframes. Now for this, because the main focus is not in view, I want these to come into view pretty quickly. Otherwise the scene doesn't make sense. You wouldn't want to look at the sky for 5 seconds and then realize that there's two men standing here. I want you to look at the sky and quickly see these two men. I want them to come into view quickly, but I also want it to be smooth. So what we will do is we're going to left click and drag across these two keyframes so they're selected and they will be surrounded in this blue tint. Now we're going to come to this graph editor here. We're going to left click it and you're going to see this is our graph. Now don't be afraid of this graph. All this line represents is the speed of the pixels moving. So essentially, if I create a large peak, this means that at the start, there's few pixels moving. Look, there's only 28 pixels per second moving in the position value. Whereas if I travel further up this peak, we now have 1,200 pixels moving per second. So all that means is the camera is moving faster. So we essentially manipulate how fast the camera moves and at what point with this graph. Now, the shape that I'm going to use here is a graph where it quickly accelerates in and then it slows down from there on. So let's take a look at what we've created. Quickly comes into view, then slows down nicely. Now what if we dragged this handle here and we instead made a peak on the other side? Well, now it's going to move really slow for a few seconds. Then these two are going to pop into view like this. Now this could make sense if you had some text up here, but we don't have text. Now let's try a graph like this, where it's going to come in slowly, then it's going to speed up in the middle really fast, then it's going to slow down. Well, let's take a look. You'll see that these all don't make sense because the focus of the shot is not coming into view quick enough. So it just looks weird. Now, maybe if you had some text up here, it would make sense because you need to give the viewer time to read it. But in this case, we don't. So we're going to stick with a graph where it speeds up quickly at the beginning. These two come into view within about 2 seconds, and then it will slow down. Now, don't make the mistake of creating a graph that's too high up, because then this movement will look really unnatural. So let's take a look if we drag these handles as close to each other as we can, obviously while maintaining the peak at the beginning. Let's take a look. Right, that's too much. We just want to decrease it, so I'm just going to drag this handle back a little bit. So the fastest that the camera will move is just a little bit slower, and it will look more natural. Just like this. Another mistake which editors make is that these keyframes here are too close together. Now, what these keyframes mean is that at this time, the position will be here, and at this time, the position will be here. So if you only give 1 second for this big movement, it's going to look too quick. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. If we just give this movement 2 seconds, it's going to look like this. Now that looks horrible. And this is the biggest mistake that video editors make. You don't give enough time for the keyframe. So everything just looks jolty and it doesn't look right. It doesn't look natural. A big movement like this needs time. Because in real life, when a camera moves that far, it cannot do it in 1 second or 2 seconds. So that's why we give it maybe 6 seconds or 7 or 8 seconds. Let's take a look now. You see, even 6 seconds is not long enough. Let's give it 7 seconds and take a look at what that looks like. Now it is smooth. So the keyframes and the distance between them is probably the most important thing, because no matter what you do with this speed graph, you cannot fix keyframes that are too close together. I can change this no matter how much I want to. If these are too close, I will never be able to fix it. Too fast. If I drag it like this. Too fast. This is why you need to always make sure that you have distance between your keyframes, because this is the most important part of editing. This is what makes your videos look professional and natural. You need to make sure you have distance between your keyframes. And secondly, then you look at the graph and you think, what's the most natural movement? Well, things always need to accelerate in real life. You can never go from 0 to 100, just like this. You need to accelerate. So we create an acceleration with the graph, and I'm going to show you what that looks like again. So your graph will initially look like this, 1 constant speed. Now for this movement, I'd like it to quickly accelerate into the shot, into the frame, so we can see these two, and then decelerate slowly. So in order to do that, I'm going to grab this right handle here, I'm going to drag it to the left and create a peak, something like this. Then I'm going to take this left handle and I'm going to drag it to the right. So it will accelerate quickly. These two come into view. Then it will take about 4, 5, 6 seconds for it to slow down, like this. And that is how you create a basic 3D scene. Now this only uses 3 elements, and of course it can get more complicated, but it's all just making sure that you pay attention to the details and follow the steps which I've done in this video. 3D is not as complicated as you'd think. It just takes a little bit of understanding. Now, I promised 2 bonus tips to make this look even better. And what this is to make sure that the middle of the screen is always the focus. Now, what we're going to do for this is we're going to come to the bottom left, we're going to right click, we're going to press new, we're going to make an adjustment layer, and we're going to then come up here to the top toolbar and we're going to press this rectangle tool. Now we're going to press Q so we can make it an ellipse tool. So we're going to press Q twice. We're going to have this ellipse tool here. So to do that, I'm going to come up to roughly the top left corner. I'm just going to left click and drag all the way here. So we've got roughly an ellipse looking like this. Now this is just creating a mask for the adjustment layer. So we can now add a fast box blur. So just come to your effects panel here and add the fast box blur. Just drag that onto your adjustment layer. Now you'll see that if I add this blur, it's going to occur within the mask. Although we want to change it so everything that we put here in the effect happens outside of the mask. So all we need to do for that is to press inverted. Now obviously this blur is way too much, so I'd recommend something like a value of 7. This looks kind of natural, but there's quite an abrupt edge here. It's quite an obvious edge between the blur and where it's not. So you can fix that quite easily. We come down to the adjustment layer, we open the mask, and we just increase the mask feather to something roughly like 150. Now you don't want to increase it too much, otherwise the feather will come too far in and then it just blurs the whole image. So let me reset this. Like I said, something like 150 is enough. Now with the fast box blur, the number of iterations also determines how blurred it is. Now we don't want an iteration like 3. This is too high. So I like to decrease this to something like 1. That brings a more natural look. And then I also like to come to the blur dimensions and set it to horizontal. So now we have quite a natural camera blur here. Now, of course, if you want to increase the feather or decrease the blur, that's completely up to you. But you can see that we're now creating focus in the middle of the screen because this outer part is blurred. Now, if I turn that off, you can see that now there's less focus. So now we're going to add a vignette. Now what this does is it makes the corners more dark. Now you can play with these settings, although this roughly looks good for what we have here. I've got the amount at 72, the angle of view at 50, and the rest I haven't changed. So if we take a look at what this looked like before, it looks like this. After, it's like this. We have more focus towards the middle. Now let's play it. This is a very subtle difference, but this is the difference between a beginner editor and an advanced editor. You can see that the edges and the corners are more noticeable now, whereas if I turn this on, you can see they're less noticeable. The next bonus trick which Magnates Media use is camera shake. Now, you can do this in many ways, although I like to do this with the camera point of interest. Now what you do for this is you open up the point of interest by pressing on the camera, pressing A on your keyboard. This will bring up the point of interest. Now you want to hold Alt and left click on this stopwatch here. And then we're going to type in the expression wiggle bracket 3,1. Now all this means is that 3 times per second, this value here is going to move somewhere between the value of 1. So the left number is the frequency and the right number is the amplitude. So if I make this 100 and I make this 20, it means it's going to fluctuate between this value of 20 100 times per second. Although that's too much, so I'll show you what too much looks like. As you can see, far too much. I like to set a value just small, like 3,1. It just adds a small subtle camera shake. Now let's take a look if we turned off our camera shake and turned off our adjustment layer. And with the camera shake and the adjustment layer, here's what it looks like. So by now you should fully understand how to create a basic 3D scene in After Effects. If you have any questions, then leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one where we're going to create a more advanced 3D scene. See ya.